wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South, produced by the Institute for Southern Studies in the McCausland College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina. Take on the South explores the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truth and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South. Today we are going to talk about a war. Nearly as many men died in captivity during this war as were killed in the whole of the Vietnam War. Hundreds of thousands died of disease and exposure. Roughly 2% of the population, about 620,000 men, lost their lives in the line of duty in this war. Today, that would be about 6 million people. This war lasted 4 years, roamed over an entire country. It was a brutal affair, a war at once using modern technology and pre-modern ways of killing. It was a war pitting brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. This was the American Civil War. The scope and scale and intensity of this war was so great that historians have tried to get their arms around it in a number of ways. Some have tried the aerial approach, looking at the entirety of the war from 30,000 feet. Others elect to access the war through a detailed account of significant battles, Gettysburg, Vicksburg. Still others, like our guest today, delve into the war by recounting in exquisite detail the history of a regiment. This path has enormous dividends and grants readers access to the brutality and glory of the war, the dignity of the soldier, the courage of the leader, and the viscerality of America's bloodiest conflict. We know these dividends because Benjamin L. Cwayna shows us them in his new book, The Invincible Twelfth, the 12th South Carolina Infantry of the Gregg-McGowan Brigade, Army of Northern Virginia. It's going to be published later this year by Savas Beatty from California. Ben, welcome to Take on the South.
You, Mark, I appreciate it. Very good to be here with you.
Well, it's great to be with you. I'd prefer it in person, but you are currently in Michigan, is that right?
That's correct. I live in Grand Ledge, Michigan, right in the middle of the state.
A very fine state. I worked there many years ago. Before we get into the substance of what is a very finely researched and articulated book, in my estimation, can you just tell us something about your background? Because, if somebody were to read this book, they would think, oh, this is written by a history professor, but you're not a history professor, are you?
No, I'm an attorney here in private practice here in Michigan. I have my own practice. Up until early last year, I was in partnership with a couple of other gentlemen who recently retired, so I'm now on my own. But I have a very thriving law practice here in mid-Michigan, do all sorts of areas of law, mostly civil litigation. I don't do any criminal work anymore, but it's fun, and it actually segues well with writing, because I love to write. I write a lot for my work, whether it's contracts or briefs for court, and so I really enjoy the act of writing and putting together a story.
And also the research too, though, Ben. I mean, your book is a very forensically researched piece of work, not unlike legal work, right? I mean, there's a kind of overlap there between what an historian does and what a lawyer does. And I think that it shows manifestly in this book, which is beautifully researched. And you, as people always say to me, you're not from around here, are you? Where are you from?
Well, I'm originally from the west side of Michigan on Lake Michigan, Muskegon area. And I went down here to Michigan State University for college, undergrad, and then law school, and stayed in this area of mid-Michigan where I've lived now since the late 90s.
So you are a Yankee, in other words, right?
I am a Yankee full and through. I do have ancestors that fought for both the Union Army, 111th Ohio, and then I have some ancestors that fought in the 7th Tennessee and the 54th North Carolina.
So when I said brother versus brother, that probably resonated with you, didn't it?
Very much. I mean, this was a family affair, and it was, as you aptly put it in your introduction, it was a gruesome affair, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to attack this subject. I've always loved history, and to be I've always read a lot of books about the Civil War, and I always wanted to contribute some, albeit small, portion to the literature, and that's what I've tried to do with this book.
Well, you elected to write on the most written about subject in American history, and that takes a certain courage right there. But so, when you were a young lad, did you get into the Civil War by virtue of your family background, or somebody that you knew, or did you go to a reenactment, for example? What was your access point?
Yeah, great question. I was 8 or 9 years old, and I remember watching on television. It was on CBS, the Blue and the Gray miniseries with Stacy Keach and John Hammond and Lloyd Bridges, and I was just captured by that miniseries. In today's standards, it probably wouldn't be a very good miniseries, but back then it was wonderful, and it captured my interest and my imagination. And I started to read more about the war, adult books at a very young age. I read Lee's Lieutenants by Douglas Southall Freeman, Shelby Foote, and that was during the time period when the Civil War was kind of in its heyday of remembrance, the late 80s, early 90s, when I was coming of age. The Ken Burns series came out. The movie Gettysburg came out. Civil War Journal was on every weekend for anybody my age. We would, get up and record it on the VHS. And so I read all of these great authors, and there were a lot of books coming out at that time, and it captured me. And I can't explain it to this day. It's just something that has always fascinated me from a young age, and I've always been a voracious reader. I've got hundreds of books, and I've read all of them. And then as I got older, the desire to want to write a book based on primary sources really took hold. And I
Yeah.
did attend a reenactment when I was a young. My parents were very supportive of this endeavor, and they took me to a reenactment when I was around 12, and I ended up joining a Civil War reenacting group that I'm still a member of today, and they portrayed both a Federal regiment and a Confederate regiment,
Okay.
and the Confederate regiment was the 12th South Carolina, which
Aha.
is the unit that I've written about.
Yeah, I gotcha. All right. So that's your access point. It makes perfect sense.
Yes.
Because I was going to ask, I was talking about the book, why the South Carolina 12th? I mean, there are hundreds of regiments that you could have selected. Is it because of that early exposure, or was there something in
Yeah.
addition to that?
Yes, I joined this reenacting group, and all of the men who were involved in it at that time were Vietnam veterans, Korean veterans, and they were one in particular had ancestors that had fought in the regiment. And I was just interested in learning about this unit that I was portraying,
Mhm.
and I wanted to learn everything I could. So I bought every book I could that touched on the regiment's actions in battle and on the march, and I would always scour the index to see, how much 12th South Carolina material was in that particular work. And so I bought every book, and in my mind, I knew someday I was going to do this. I just didn't know how or when.
Yeah, that's a lovely access point. It makes perfect sense to me. It's also a kind of a fortuitous choice too, isn't it? Because this was a special regiment, special in many ways. Could you take us through, why this was such a significant regiment during the Civil War?
Yeah, I mean, and I didn't know this until I got into the research. I mean, I always thought, it was a typical regiment that fought in Lee's army. But as I got into the research and the granular detail of it, it really took on a life of its own. And I began to see that it was an outstanding combat regiment. It's a purely military history. I mean, if people enjoy tactics and the minutia and the granular level of battles and tactics, this is a good book for them. But as I got into it, it takes on its own life, and the personalities and the people that you're researching, and you become very close to them over time. I mean, I can name several soldiers that I loved reading their things, their items, and it brought the story more to life in a way that was, as a history buff, it was really cool to experience.
So it might surprise viewers and listeners to really appreciate the extent of the sacrifice and death that this regiment experienced, because it starts off, or during the entire course of the war, has about 1,400 soldiers. Is that right?
Yeah, typical regiment during the Civil War on paper was about 1,000 men,
Okay.
10 companies of 100 men each. But as the Confederate Army would go back to their home locales during the war and recruit men and bring them up to the lines, whereas the Federals, the Union forces, would generally create just new regiments.
Mm-hmm.
And so about 1,400 men served in the regiment over the course of the war from August of 1861 to April of 1865. And there were only about 150 of them left at Appomattox, which, an astounding rate of loss. But as I got into the book, I mean, this regiment was so tough, and the men involved in it were hard scrabble men, and they fought hard, and they were always in the most precarious situations of these battles, and they were perpetually or most of the time on the flank of the brigade, and they were always getting flank fire on their right or their left, and they always seemed to do very well. There was only a couple of times during the war where they got ejected out of a position or failed to take a position. But by and large, what I was impressed with most about reading about the regiment and researching it was how good they really were. And if you read Confederate history, there are those regiments that stick out, or those brigades that stick out: the Louisiana Tigers, the Texas Brigade, the Stonewall Brigade, for example. Gregg's and McGowan's brigade was a very good brigade, and they don't get much press in the Civil War literature, and I was wanting to bring that to the fore in this book, and I think I did.
So why do you think they were so good, Ben? I mean, what made this regiment so tough and so effective? Because it's perfectly possible to have that number of men and be a wholly ineffective regiment. What made them special?
Leadership. They had excellent leadership. Their first colonel was a very dour, uninspiring politician who his name was Richard Gilmill Dunavant, and he was a political appointee. And he didn't last very long. And the second colonel, though, was an upcountry politician named Dixon Barnes, who was in his mid-40s at the time he took command of the regiment. And he was described as having a flowing white beard, and he was just very aggressive and impetuous. And what he did is he drilled the regiment incessantly when he took over. And that drill and that discipline carried over onto the battlefield, in my opinion. And his successors, he was killed at the he was mortally wounded at Sharpsburg only a few months after he took command. But his successors, I think, took that model and applied it to the regiment moving forward. And so they were very well drilled. The other regiments in McGowan's and Gregg's brigade were not necessarily as well drilled, and the other soldiers write about that.
So in other words, this regiment had a certain contemporary fame. Is that correct?
They did, and I didn't realize that until I got into it. But any Civil War buff will know the name E. Porter Alexander. He's a famous Confederate artillerist, and he wrote in his memoirs that the 12th had a particular reputation for being excellent on the march and very tough in battle. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason why these men don't get the credit that the other units do in Lee's army is because their commanders, a lot of them were killed in combat, and didn't write memoirs or histories after the war.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest reason that the unit doesn't get a lot of press is because they were humble men. And I don't think they felt the need to go out there and publicize what they did. They did what they did. Obviously, they lost the war, so that had a factor in it. But I don't think they felt the need to go out and publicize it. They let their work stand on the field.
That's a refreshing thing in and of itself, isn't it?
Very much.
Letting your work speak for itself, and it's brutal work too. Uh, Give us a quick kind of highlights of the most famous battle that the 12th were involved in. I mean, give us your top three. Gettysburg is one, correct?
Well, I would say their most famous action was at Spotsylvania Courthouse on May 12th, 1864. This is literally ground zero for the Civil War. I mean, it is the most harsh gunfire of the entire war on probably ever heard or seen on the North American continent.
Mm-hmm.
And they were in the very apex of this 20-acre area that was just being obliterated by Federal attack, bullets, artillery shells, and it was raining. They spent 18 hours fighting in these trenches, and the bodies were literally being torn apart by the bullets. A tree that was about, don't quote me on this, but I think it was 12 to 18 inches thick was severed by the bullets of the gunfire, falling near the flank of the 12th South Carolina in the midst of this horrific combat. But they plugged Lee's line and they held the line for Lee's army and bought him enough time to create a second set of breastworks to the rear. And that morning, they were all pulled back after that fight. So I would say that's number one.
Okay.
I'd say the number two was probably Second Manassas in August of 1862. They held the very left flank of Stonewall Jackson's position along the unfinished railroad cut and repulsed several assaults by the Union Army. And in fact, went on the offensive to actually take the initiative away from the Yankees in the very beginning of the morning. And the third battle where they really did well was at Antietam a few weeks after Second Manassas, where they, along with the rest of A.P. Hill's Light Division, marched 17 miles, starting around 7:30 in the morning. They marched about 17 miles from Harper's Ferry up to Sharpsburg and were thrown into the combat at the very last minute and saved Lee's army from being cut off from the Potomac, and the 12th South Carolina alone made three separate charges down into a gully near the southern end of the battlefield and literally started this momentum that carried the Confederate Army to victory on that portion of the field and really stalled General Burnside's juggernaut that was coming towards Sharpsburg. Gettysburg, to take your point on Gettysburg, they did very well at Gettysburg, but I would not even count that as their finest hour. It was one of their finest hours, but I'd say their three were Spotsylvania Courthouse, Second Manassas, and Sharpsburg.
So this is really a kind of catalog of courage more than anything else, isn't it? I mean,
very much.
Enormous forbearance, enormous courage. And that's certainly an important part of your book. That's what you come away with. But the other part, and maybe you could talk a bit about this, is the sheer brutality that these soldiers endured, faced, and witnessed. I mean, this is a visceral war. People, wrongly in my estimation, tend to think of the Civil War as a bit quaint sometimes, don't they? As a kind of as a pre-modern war. But as you just said, we're talking about breastworks, we're talking about artillery shells, we're talking about trenches. This has a First World War feel to it. Can you, as you were going through your research, can you kind of describe some of the almost unbelievably brutal things that these soldiers engaged in and witnessed?
I've got a story that comes right to mind. One of the men who wrote a very prolific memoir after the war to raise money for Confederate veterans was J.R. Boyles. He was a lieutenant in Company C, and I just loved his writing. He was very prolific, very detailed, told a lot of stories, and he didn't even talk about the regiment. He talked about his little mess of men, his company, what they were doing, the stories. And he had been a sergeant prior to Gettysburg, and he ran for lieutenant in their company of Company C. And to show you a little bit of the politics of even a regiment, one man who didn't like him put off his furlough for a few weeks so he could stay and vote against him for lieutenant. And he ended up winning the election, and he becomes lieutenant. He commands. He comes into command of Company C on July 1st, 1863, on the fields outside of Gettysburg, and an artillery shell blows off his leg, splinters it. And he was laying there on this open field in the sun. It was probably 85 degrees out. And the stretcher bearers came and put him on a stretcher, or actually they had to manufacture a stretcher with a blanket and his sword belt and some poles that they found near a creek. And they took him down to the Willoughby Run, and he begged them to lay him in the water so that he could have some relief. And they laid him in the water, and he said the water ran red with my blood. And he said, I knew that if I lived, I was ruined forever. He ends up going to a hospital a few miles to the rear between Gettysburg and Cashtown, and he begs the brigade surgeon, not the regimental surgeon, the brigade surgeon, to do his amputation, because the regimental surgeon, a man by the name of Dr. Bailey, had a very poor reputation for amputating limbs, and he was a drunkard. So he begged the brigade surgeon to do it, and the brigade surgeon agreed that he would. And they put him under chloroform, and he woke up 2 days later and found out that the regimental surgeon, the drunkard, had done the amputation. And he botched it so badly that he had to do it twice. And he botched it so badly that Mr. Boyles could never wear a prosthetic leg for the rest of his years, and he lived well into the 1900s. And so those sorts of stories, and they're over and over. I mean, the book is full of them on how these men suffered during this carnage. And you're right, the Civil War is known as a gentleman's war. It was the last probably gentleman's war we had, but it was so brutal and so terrible, and these men on both sides suffered horrendously.
I think they did, and I think that captures some of that experience very well. Let's step back and have a kind of aerial view on this. I think that historians, when they write a book and they put it into press, just like you have, oftentimes they step back and say, this is what I learned about something other than the particulars of this subject. So I suppose my question to you, Ben, is, what did you learn about human nature writing this book?
It's a great question. I learned that these were very simple men, and I don't mean that in a negative way. They were men who had very simple virtues. They weren't perfect, but there was an innocence about them and a toughness and a determination to see the thing through all the way, regardless of how it turned out. And so I think I learned about, now also I would say that their civilian lives transferred over into their military lives. These were men that were from communities, small communities in northern South Carolina, Lancaster County, Fairfield County, York County, and they took their home ties to the Army with them. They would write letters back home. They would defend people back home. They would engage in discussions about, well, so-and-so it's rumored back home. I got a letter from home that so-and-so deserted during the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, and I'm here to tell you that that's not true, that he was right in line with me. They would write home to the newspapers to let them know how they were doing. They would have visitors come to camp to visit them in the field from home. And so I think I learned that a man's civilian persona and his civilian life did not necessarily leave him when he joined the Army. These were families, they were brothers, husbands, fathers, all fighting alongside each other. And there was a camaraderie that is very hard to describe unless you could be there.
Yeah, yeah. This took you, what, 16 years to research and write? Is that correct?
Yeah, I never really got hard into it until about probably 8 years ago.
Okay.
But yeah, it's taken about 16 years of research and starts and stops and fits and goes and that sort of thing. But yeah,
In between your other job, I mean,
right,
this is
right.
a lot of work, and you did a lot of research in South Carolina for this. Is that correct?
Yeah, University of South Carolina, North Carolina, University of North Carolina is the Southern Historical Collection. I found an excellent cache of letters from Lieutenant or Captain Cadwallader Jones Jr., which, to my knowledge, have never been cited in any Civil War book, and they're outstanding letters. I'd like to maybe transcribe them someday and put them in a book themselves because they could stand alone. But yeah, I visited some places, and however, I will say this: a lot of places nowadays you can do a lot of this online, which is very convenient. And I'm not this was my first foray into historical research, and so it was a bit eye-opening as to how much there is out there, more than I thought there would be. But the best source I had, by far, was newspaper articles. And I cannot tell you how much I was able to glean out of historical newspapers, both during and after the war. It was incredible. It was a gold mine for me. Yes. And
it's handy,
filled in a lot of gaps.
Yeah, that search function for names is especially useful, right?
It was incredible.
Yeah.
And I would just, and I still do. I love going to these newspapers and just looking up things. It was the greatest source I could ever have. And anyone who's looking to write a book, I would say, don't discount newspapers.
A hearty second from me on that. So, without putting a damper on anything, you're about to come out with this book, and I'm just curious, what's next? Are you going to do another one, or are you kind of done for the moment?
Well, I'm going to take a little break, but I would like to write a full-scale history of A.P. Hill's Third Corps, which was, for any Civil War buff in Lee's army, you've got Longstreet's First Corps, Stonewall Jackson's Second Corps with Ewell. But the Third Corps came rather late in the game, relatively late, and it was under command of A.P. Hill, and A.P. Hill was killed in the last week of the war. And I think because of that, his corps doesn't get a lot of press in the literature and a lot of notoriety. And I would like to do a history, a command study of the commanders and their personalities as it relates to A.P. Hill's Third Corps, which the 12th was part of that corps. So it fits well.
It sounds like it does. Another recovery project for a regiment, kind of not discarded necessarily, but eclipsed by more famous people.
Right.
Ben Cwayna, author of The Invincible Twelfth, the 12th South Carolina Infantry of the Gregg-McGowan Brigade, Army of Northern Virginia, published by Savas Beatty, California, coming out later this year. Thank you for being Take on the South, and congratulations on a fine piece of work.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
Our pleasure. That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on YouTube, Spotify, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Be sure to click and subscribe. Take on the South is produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and the McCausland College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our soundtrack. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.